Winter, 1943. Deep beneath the Reich Chancellery, the lights flicker in a darkened room. German naval officers lean over a trembling projector beam, their faces half-lit, their breath visible in the cold air. On the wall, grainy reconnaissance footage rolls. Vast shadows move across the Pacific. Ships so large they seem unreal. Decks crowded with aircraft. Columns of smoke, steel in motion. An officer mutters under his breath, "Unmöglich, impossible." He had seen warships before, but never this. Cities, floating cities, armed and alive. The film ends. The silence feels heavier than the sea. For the first time, the German Navy understands. America is building a fleet the world has never seen. In 1939, the world's oceans were divided by ambition and fear. The Kriegsmarine, Germany's navy, was reborn from the ashes of Versailles, its leaders dreaming of restoring. The empire lost at sea in 1918. Admiral Erich Raeder spoke of a future, balanced fleet, where new battleships, like Bismarck and Tirpitz, would rival Britain's Royal Navy. But beneath that dream lay limits, steel shortages, fuel scarcity, and a coastline hemmed by blockade. Across the Atlantic, the United States remained distant. Isolationist voices echoed through Congress. The Great Depression still weighed on American industry, and most believed the ocean itself would keep war away. The U.S. Navy, though professional and proud, was a fraction of the Royal Navy's size. Carriers like Lexington and Saratoga were considered experimental, impressive curiosities, not yet proven weapons of war. Yet the seeds of transformation were already sown. American engineers, naval strategists, and shipbuilders quietly debated the future of sea power. A few visionaries, men like Admiral William Halsey and Ernest King, began to imagine an ocean battlefield ruled not by guns, but by wings. They studied British carrier trials, Japanese experiments, and their own limited exercises, concluding that aircraft could reach beyond the horizon where guns could not. Still, few in Berlin paid attention. To the German General Staff, America was a nation of automobiles and jazz, vast, wealthy, but militarily clumsy. They measured strength in divisions and tonnage, not factories and manpower. Their eyes were fixed on Europe, not on the endless shipyards that lined the American coasts. When war erupted in September 1939, U-boats dominated German naval thought. Submarines were cheap, stealthy, and deadly. They were the weapon of the weak against the strong. The Atlantic campaign became a chess match of sonar, convoys, and torpedoes. The concept of a floating city, a mobile airbase striking from thousands of miles away, felt like fantasy to men still fighting for control of the North Atlantic lanes. But in the background, far from the bombing raids and blockades, the United States was stirring. Shipyards in Virginia, California, and Washington were beginning to hum. Engineers drafted blueprints not for single vessels, but for fleets, each one larger, faster, more efficient than anything afloat. The German Admiralty had no idea yet. They believed time was on their side, but time was the one resource America was already mass-producing. The ocean, once Germany's advantage in stealth, was about to become America's stage for power. By late 1940, the sound of hammers replaced silence along America's coasts. From Brooklyn to Bremerton, shipyards that had lain dormant since World War I roared back to life. Steel poured into molds day and night. Sparks flew like fireflies beneath the cranes. President Franklin D. Roosevelt called it the arsenal of democracy, a phrase that became prophecy. Within months, America's peacetime factories were turning out destroyers, submarines, and aircraft faster than any nation had imagined possible. But among these steel giants rose something even more audacious: the aircraft carrier. Each new hull was not just a warship. It was a city. Thousands of men could live, work, and fight aboard a single vessel. Kitchens fed armies, elevators lifted squadrons of aircraft, and decks stretched longer than city blocks. These were floating airfields, self-contained, mobile fortresses capable of striking any coastline on Earth. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor in December 1941, most of America's battleships lay in ruin. The old world of naval warfare, dominated by armored gun platforms, died that morning. Yet, by sheer chance, America's carriers were at sea, spared from destruction. From that moment on, the future of naval warfare belonged to them. Washington responded with an industrial fury unseen in human history. New designs like the Essex-class carriers were approved before the blueprints were even finalized. Shipyards worked in shifts around the clock. Men, women, and even teenagers joined the effort. Welding crews labored under floodlights through the night, often finishing a ship weeks ahead of schedule. By 1943, a single carrier could be completed in less than a year. In secret, naval architects coordinated across the country to standardize every bolt, beam, and plate, allowing dozens of massive ships to be built simultaneously. The logistical miracle was staggering. Hundreds of subcontractors, thousands of factories, and millions of workers moving as one machine. At the same time, the U.S. Navy trained an entirely new generation of pilots, deck crews, and commanders. They drilled relentlessly, transforming chaotic airfields into precise floating ecosystems. Every takeoff, every landing, every fuel line mattered. A mistake at sea meant death. And they learned fast. Across the Atlantic, German intelligence began receiving reports. Blurred reconnaissance photos showing enormous silhouettes in American ports. Some dismissed them as propaganda. Others feared the truth. These were not battleships. They were something far more dangerous. Instruments of mobility, projection, and endurance. By mid-1942, as Germany was bogged down in Russia and the Atlantic War dragged on, whispers spread through Berlin's naval circles. The Americans are building cities that float. They were right, and soon those cities would move, carrying entire air forces across oceans. The human engine. Each American carrier was more than steel and rivets. It was a living organism. Inside its decks pulsed the rhythm of 3,000 men. Engineers sweating in the heat of engine rooms, cooks feeding thousands before dawn, pilots memorizing the sea's moods before flight. Life aboard a carrier was unlike any other front. There was no mud, no trench, no horizon. Only endless ocean and the trembling vibration of turbines beneath one's boots. Sailors often spoke of the ship as a city that never slept. Each man had a purpose. Each station mattered. In the darkness of night watches, when the decks were silent and the horizon empty, they could feel the hum of engines, a reminder that America itself was alive and moving beneath them. For the Germans, this human machine was unfathomable. Their war at sea had been defined by stealth and scarcity. Small crews, cramped submarines, rationed fuel. The idea of thousands of men coordinating like clockwork on a single ship the size of a town defied their understanding of naval warfare. The tactical revolution. Before the war, admirals believed that battleships were kings of the sea. Their armor and guns defined power. But by 1942, the aircraft carrier shattered that doctrine. For the first time, naval combat was no longer fought within the horizon. Carriers could strike from hundreds of miles away, unseen, unheard, unstoppable. From the air came reconnaissance, attack, and defense. All in one motion. Pilots became the new artillery, guided by radar and radio rather than sight and smoke. This new way of war was psychological as much as tactical. Enemy ships could no longer see their destroyers. The battle began long before the first shot, in the silent blue above. To the German officers reviewing footage of Pacific engagements, this was terrifying. Their fleet, built around surface guns and U-boats, was becoming obsolete before their eyes. The power once held by a single battleship's broadside was now in the hands of dozens of pilots launched from a moving city. The psychological shock for the German naval elite, pride had always been their compass. They were heirs of Tirpitz, trained under the shadow of the Bismarck, a ship that symbolized invincibility. But when reports came in from the Pacific, of Japanese carriers sunk, of American fleets replenished faster than they could be counted, disbelief set in. Captured German officers later admitted that what stunned them most wasn't the number of ships, but the speed of America's recovery. They lost 3 and built 6, one wrote in disbelief. No fleet in history could grow like that. To them, these floating cities weren't just weapons. They were symbols of something deeper: industrial immortality. Each carrier destroyed was replaced by 2 more. Each pilot lost was succeeded by a dozen trained replacements. Germany had mastered precision. America had mastered abundance. And abundance, in war, is its own form of power. The Allied eyes, even among America's allies, awe replaced doubt. British officers who visited U.S. carriers in 1943 were stunned by their scale. Hangars stacked with aircraft, workshops humming day and night, decks glowing under floodlights. One Royal Navy observer called them cities with engines, while another wrote that America had turned the ocean into an airfield. To the men aboard, these words were pride and burden alike. They knew that every takeoff, every landing, carried the weight of thousands of lives and the expectations of a nation. When they launched into the Pacific dawn, they weren't just pilots. They were ambassadors of American industry, courage, and inevitability. And as those cities moved closer to the war's heart, both allies and enemies realized that naval warfare, and perhaps warfare itself, would never again belong to the surface of the sea. 5. Engineering the impossible to build a carrier was to defy nature itself. Each ship weighed over 30,000 tons, yet needed the agility to turn, launch, and recover aircraft on a moving, unpredictable ocean. Engineers redesigned the very bones of shipbuilding. Welding replaced rivets. Modular construction replaced linear assembly. The Essex-class design became the blueprint for a naval empire. Its deck spanned over 800 feet, large enough to host a small air force. Beneath it, 5 decks of workshops, magazines, and sleeping quarters formed a steel labyrinth. Every inch was engineered for efficiency. Fuel lines snaked through pressure-sealed corridors, ammunition elevators rose through reinforced shafts, and radar masts reached skyward like cathedral spires. But what truly shocked German observers after the war was how many of these behemoths America produced. 24 Essex-class carriers, plus dozens of light and escort carriers. Each one was a marvel of organization, and yet, in American shipyards, they were being built almost like automobiles, identical, replaceable, unstoppable. To a nation fighting for survival with dwindling resources, such abundance was unthinkable. To Germany's engineers, it was a revelation, proof that industrial democracy could outbuild authoritarian precision. Command at sea leadership aboard these ships demanded a new kind of mind. Traditional admirals thought in miles and broadsides. Carrier commanders thought in hours and aircraft range. They no longer maneuvered ships toward the enemy. They positioned weather, wind, and timing. Every engagement became a calculation of waves, clouds, and courage. Men like Admiral Raymond Spruance, William Halsey, and Chester Nimitz embodied this new order. Calm, analytical, and methodical, they understood that victory was not just about destruction. It was about momentum. Their fleets moved like clockwork, striking with precision and vanishing before the enemy could respond. When German officers later studied Pacific battle records, they were struck by the professionalism of American carrier task forces. No grandstanding, no reckless gambits, only coordination, timing, and overwhelming force. The Kriegsmarine, shaped by daring U-boat captains and singular heroes, suddenly looked old-fashioned. In these American fleets, power was not embodied in one ship or one man. It was distributed, disciplined, and invisible until it struck. Technology and doctrine. Behind every flight deck lay a revolution in systems. American radar networks gave their carriers eyes that pierced fog and darkness. Combat information centers, primitive by modern standards, integrated radar screens, radio intercepts, and plotting tables into a single nerve center. These technologies allowed the U.S. Navy to fight not just harder, but smarter. German naval doctrine prized audacity and aggression. The Americans prized coordination and sustainability. Every carrier was part of a greater whole, a mobile archipelago of power connected by radio, logistics, and shared intelligence. The result was a war machine that could adapt faster than it could be destroyed. Every carrier loss became a lesson, every engagement a refinement. By 1944, the U.S. Navy was not just fighting the war, it was optimizing it. The moral landscape. To the German mind, this scale of war production was both fascinating and terrifying. Here was a nation that fought not for conquest, but for restoration, for a world order built on abundance, not scarcity. America's floating cities symbolized more than military strength. They were the physical expression of democratic endurance. German officers captured after 1945 recalled watching newsreels of American fleets moving in perfect formation, hundreds of aircraft circling above. It was like watching an industrial religion, one said. Machines and men fused by faith in production. This was perhaps the greatest shock of all. Germany's war was built on ideology, America's on logistics. And in modern war, ideology breaks where logistics endures. By 1944, those floating cities were no longer just tools of victory. They had become symbols of a new kind of civilization, one that would carry its influence far beyond the war's end. The summer of 1942, the Pacific burned beneath the sun. After Pearl Harbor, Japan ruled the waves, her carrier fleet unmatched, her pilots experienced, her tactics refined through years of war in China. The United States, reeling from loss, faced the ocean with barely a handful of operational carriers. But within 6 months, everything changed. In June 1942, at a small atoll called Midway, America's floating cities made their first stand. The Japanese Imperial Navy advanced with confidence. 4 carriers, veterans of Pearl Harbor, moving under the rising sun. The U.S. Navy, outnumbered and outgunned, relied on intelligence and nerve. Through broken codes and radio intercepts, Admiral Chester Nimitz knew where the enemy would strike. The morning of June 4th, American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, launched wave after wave of aircraft into uncertain skies. Pilots flew through storms, through flak, through death itself. Many never returned, but those who did found the heart of the Japanese fleet. 4 carriers lined up like targets. In minutes, the Pacific War changed course. American dive bombers, emerging from the clouds, hit Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu in rapid succession. Each carrier erupted into fire. Men running across decks of flame, aircraft melting where they stood. By the end of the day, Japan had lost 4 of its mightiest carriers, the core of its striking power, while America had lost only 1. The Battle of Midway was not just a victory, it was a revelation. It proved that strategy, intelligence, and industrial momentum could overturn even the most experienced foe. And as news of the battle spread, The German naval attaché in Tokyo sent a simple, chilling message back to Berlin. The Americans build ships faster than we can sink them. By 1943, that statement was no longer metaphor. American shipyards had entered overdrive. While Germany struggled to replace a single battleship, the U.S. Navy was launching a new carrier every few weeks. Convoys stretched across the Pacific like metallic arteries, feeding bases from Hawaii to the Solomons. And with each new hull came evolution. Better radar, faster elevators, stronger flight decks. The Essex-class carriers began to arrive in squadrons. They didn't sail alone. They sailed as task forces, living networks of carriers, destroyers, cruisers, and supply ships moving as one organism. In the skies above, hundreds of planes filled the air, Hellcats, Dauntlesses, Avengers, painting the clouds with the roar of industry. Below deck, men worked like clockwork, fueling, arming, repairing, launching again. The ocean itself became an assembly line. When Germany's naval command received intercepted footage of these operations, the reaction was disbelief. They watched American crews turning around entire strike groups in minutes, mechanics rolling bombs, refueling aircraft, guiding planes into perfect synchronization. To them, it looked choreographed, almost mechanical. The precision of a machine powered by human rhythm. Admiral Dönitz, commanding the U-boat fleet, dismissed it at first. "The Atlantic is ours," he claimed. But reports told another story. U-boats were vanishing faster than they could be built. American escort carriers, the smaller cousins of the Essex, now roamed the Atlantic in hunter-killer groups, using radar and aircraft to destroy the once feared wolf packs. It was no longer a contest of courage. It was a contest of capacity. And America's capacity was limitless. The seas, once divided by nations, were now ruled by production. And from Berlin to Tokyo, every officer watching those carriers understood. The world's center of power had shifted, permanently, to the decks of these floating cities. By mid-1944, the Pacific Ocean was no longer Japan's empire. It was America's proving ground. Carriers now sailed not in single fleets, but in armadas, 12, sometimes 15 carriers moving together in tight formation, protected by screens of destroyers and cruisers. Overhead, hundreds of aircraft patrolled the skies in constant shifts. The ocean below churned with wakes so vast they looked like rivers of white fire. The Japanese Navy, desperate and outnumbered, planned one last stand. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. They called it Operation A-Go. It was to be a decisive counterstrike, a final gamble to halt the American advance toward the Philippines. But what met them was not an army. It was an ecosystem. On June 19, 1944, under the blazing tropical sun, the Imperial Navy launched hundreds of aircraft toward the American fleet. Radar screens aboard U.S. carriers lit up instantly. Combat information centers, those nerve centers of war, began calculating, tracking, guiding. Pilots raced to their planes. Then, from horizon to horizon, America answered. F-6F Hellcats roared into the sky, forming walls of steel and flame. Within hours, Japanese aircraft were falling in droves. Hundreds shot down in what pilots later called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Entire squadrons vanished before reaching their targets. By sunset, the sky above the Philippine Sea was littered with wreckage. Oil fires burning on the water. Parachutes drifting into the waves. Japan lost more than 400 planes in a single day. The U.S. Navy lost barely 30. It was no longer a battle. It was annihilation. But the shock of that annihilation did not end in the Pacific. Across the world, deep in the bunkers of Berlin, German naval intelligence analyzed the reports with disbelief. They saw that the U.S. Navy had deployed 15 carriers and over 900 aircraft in one operation, a concentration of force beyond comprehension. To the Kriegsmarine, Such numbers were impossible. Their entire navy couldn't match the tonnage of a single American task force. When German engineers reviewed captured technical data, radar schematics, flight deck operations, production figures, they were astonished. One admiral reportedly whispered, "This is not a fleet. It is an industry that sails." They studied film reels smuggled through neutral channels, aerial shots of American carriers steaming in endless lines, deck crews dancing in synchrony, cranes lifting planes like clock hands. Even hardened officers, men who had commanded submarines through the Atlantic's deadliest storms, admitted a kind of awe. What terrified them most was not the technology, but the system behind it. In the Third Reich, every project fought for resources, approval, ideology. In America, industry itself was ideology. Capitalism had become a weapon, organized, relentless, and moralized through purpose. By late 1944, even Admiral Dönitz knew the truth. The U-boat war was lost. The Atlantic had become transparent. Aircraft from American escort carriers patrolled the skies day and night. Submarines that once haunted the deep were now hunted themselves, driven to extinction. Germany had built marvels, the Bismarck, the Tirpitz, and the Type Wattiewind submarine. But America had built momentum, something that could not be sunk. From the shores of Normandy to the beaches of Saipan, the American fleet projected an image no propaganda could counter. Thousands of men living, working, and fighting atop cities of steel that moved faster than nations could plan. For the first time in modern history, the ocean itself had a master. And for German officers watching from afar, that realization was as humbling as defeat itself. When the reports of the Philippine Sea reached Berlin, silence followed. Even Hitler, once obsessed with grand battleships, stopped asking about naval production. The Kriegsmarine's dream of challenging the Atlantic had evaporated into history. America had turned its factories into fleets, its fleets into floating cities. And those cities, unstoppable, self-sustaining, eternal, had reshaped the meaning of power itself. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the seas themselves seemed changed. Once, they had been ruled by empires. Britain's Grand Fleet, Germany's raiders, Japan's island empire. Now, they belonged to the Americans. Every horizon carried the silhouette of a carrier. In the Atlantic, they escorted convoys, guarded shipping lanes, and watched over Europe's broken coastlines. In the Pacific, they loomed like guardians above the ruins of war. Enterprise, Essex, Bunker Hill, Lexington, their decks now quiet, their planes folded like wings at rest. The battleship, that centuries-old symbol of naval pride, had been dethroned. The great guns of Yamato and Bismarck, once thought invincible, had proven powerless against the reach of the sky. It was not armor that won the oceans. It was mobility, coordination, and air power. Historians would later call it the age of the carrier. But to the men who lived it, it felt like the beginning of something far larger. These ships had not merely won battles. They had redrawn the map of civilization. For Germany's officers, the aftermath was a bitter education. Captured admirals studied Allied archives with fascination and despair. They read reports detailing how America had built 151 carriers, from massive fleet carriers to the smaller escort types that roamed the Atlantic. They learned how entire shipyards had been converted into conveyor belts of naval power. Each vessel completed faster than the enemy could plan its response. One German engineer, interrogated in 1946, reportedly said, "We built weapons. They built systems, and that difference, invisible during the war, had decided its outcome. America's floating cities became more than military assets. They were political symbols, proof of what industrial democracy could achieve." While Europe rebuilt from ashes, the United States maintained its fleets as extensions of influence, anchoring the post-war world under a new order of stability and surveillance. The ocean, once the frontier of nations, had become a canvas for power projection. Every American carrier that sailed into a foreign port carried not just aircraft, but authority. In Berlin, officers who had once mocked America's mass production warfare now understood the lesson. Quantity, when guided by precision and purpose, becomes quality. And the quiet decks of those carriers, lined with folded planes and men at ease, were the visible proof that the future of war had left the shore behind. In the aftermath of surrender, when German officers were led through Allied archives and shipyards, their silence spoke volumes. They had built submarines by hand, men welding in cramped pens beneath air raids. Now they stood before American dry docks the size of towns, where ships were assembled in weeks by teams who had never seen combat. For Admiral Karl Dönitz, the reality was bitter. He had staked his war on the belief that the Atlantic could be strangled, that U-boats could starve Britain and isolate America. Instead, he saw film of escort carriers patrolling those same waters, small but lethal, hunting submarines with radar-guided precision. What he once called the dark ocean had become transparent, every shadow revealed by technology. Post-war interrogations revealed a mix of admiration and dread. One senior German naval planner described American production as a war fought by mathematics. Another observed that their greatest weapon was time. Time to build, time to adapt, time to overwhelm. These were men trained to respect craftsmanship, precision, and hierarchy. And now they faced a nation whose victory had come from decentralization, innovation, and trust in systems over individuals. Across the Atlantic, American commanders also began to reflect. The war had proven not just their strength, but their fragility. The vast networks of logistics that fed the carriers had to remain constant. Fuel lines, steel supplies, maintenance cycles. A single break could cripple momentum. Thus, even in triumph, they saw the danger of their own creation, a machine that could never stop moving. And yet, the aircraft carrier endured, evolving from weapon to symbol. By 1947, as tensions with the Soviet Union grew, the same floating cities that had crushed empires became ambassadors of deterrence. They carried not just planes now, but nuclear capability, radar networks, and the promise, or threat, of instant projection anywhere on Earth. For Germany's surviving admirals, studying the early Cold War, it was clear. America had done what the old empires never could. It had turned the ocean into a highway of permanence. One former Kriegsmarine strategist wrote in his post-war memoir, "We once believed the ocean belonged to no one. Now it belongs to those who can live upon it. And indeed, America could live upon it. Its fleets circled the globe without fear of port or fuel. Its cities at sea became laboratories of the future, engineering marvels that bridged the gap between war and peace." By 1950, as new supercarriers like USS Midway and USS Coral Sea entered service, the last vestiges of the old naval world vanished. The Bismarck, the Tirpitz, even the legendary Yamato, all were relics of an era when power was measured in armor. Now, power was measured in reach, and America's reach was infinite. History rarely pauses to admire what it creates, but when the storm of war finally passed and the smoke cleared from the oceans, something extraordinary remained. Cities that could sail. The aircraft carrier was more than steel or strategy. It was civilization at sea, a self-sustaining organism of power, precision, and purpose. It carried not only aircraft, but the spirit of an industrial nation that believed no distance was too far, no ocean too wide. To the Germans who once watched those shadowy silhouettes on the projector reel, it had seemed almost supernatural. To the Americans who built them, it was simply the result of belief in labor, in systems, in progress. These floating cities changed warfare, but they also changed how nations saw themselves. They blurred the line between land and water, peace and power. They became the visible proof that in the modern age, dominance would no longer come from territory, but from mobility. And in that sense, those German officers were right to be shocked. They had witnessed not just a new weapon, but a new civilization, one forged upon the sea, destined to shape the world long after the war had ended. The engines have long gone silent, but the wake of those floating cities still moves across history, steady, endless, and unseen beneath the waves.